My mother was a special ed teacher in the South Bronx. And so I grew up with war stories of being in that classroom, the challenges she faced in meeting the needs of her children who were duly blessed by having disabilities and being poor, and the challenges she had in working in a school with a principal who didn't understand what she did and why she did it. As I moved into becoming an autism researcher, I came into increasing contact with families of children with disabilities, and I learned the war stories from their side. And the challenges they had in communicating the needs of their children and their family to teachers and schools. And my research in many ways stems from a place of advocacy. I think of myself as a research-informed advocate, as an advocacy-informed researcher. That's what I am. And I often get invited being a weird word to use, to IEP meetings. I go to a lot of IEP meetings. I go to a lot of due process hearings, and usually by the time I get there, they look like this, right? Usually by the time normally civil people are acting in decidedly uncivil ways, and they have become entrenched in a way of thinking and a decision about what is right and what is wrong, and usually I'm there way too late, and the most I can do is help in some way to clean up the pieces. And I have been very interested in this as an advocate. I was very fortunate to have a postdoc join me a couple of years ago, Ghazi Azad, who was an autism support teacher in public schools, and she was interested in this as a researcher. And why parents and teachers don't communicate better with each other. What is going on that this is such a challenge and that it becomes so litigious so quickly? So let's think about how special education teachers are trained. This is the curriculum from one of the top 5 special ed programs in the United States. It does not look very different from those in the top 20 or any other for that matter. You learn a lot about instruction of children with autism or instruction of children with disabilities, how to use assistive technology, how to manage your classroom, addressing issues related to communication. You have a huge practicum component. Remarkably missing from every single one of these curricula is how to talk with parents, or how to talk with any adult for that matter. And it turns out that a lot of what you do as a special education teacher is talk with adults, with the one-to-ones and aides in your classroom, with your principal, with the general education teacher, and of course, perhaps most importantly, with parents. But they don't learn how to do that. So parents, you should know that. They didn't learn how to do this, right? So we were trying to figure out what is going on. They have no training. Parents also don't get a course in how to talk with teachers. So we have that double thing going on for us. So one thought that Ghazi had was, well, do they even agree on what the challenge is that these children are facing? And so she polled them, and she asked them, what are your top 3 challenges for this child? She asked the parent that, and she asked the teacher that, and she asked them that right before a parent-teacher conference. And it turns out that half of the time they agree on what the primary challenge facing this child is, whether it's behavior or communication, social ability, accessing the curriculum, whatever it is, they agree. And 30%, more than 30% of the time, they agree on what the second most important problem is. It turns out that 69% of the time, most of the time, they agree on, if you combine that primary and secondary concern, they're kind of on the same page about what the challenge is facing that child. So it's not that. It's not that parents and teachers don't agree about what's going on, although we know in a third of the cases they don't. So maybe it's what they talk about. So remember, this happened right before the parent-teacher conference. So then Ghazi followed them into the parent-teacher conference, or actually a little recording device did. And she recorded the parent-teacher conference, and then she transcribed it afterwards and looked at what they talked about. And so what we can see here, let's focus on the bars on the left. What percentage of the time did they talk about neither the parent-teacher talk about the concern? Right? So 50% of the time, neither the parent nor the teacher talked about the thing that they said was most important to talk about. 30% of the time, neither of them talked about the second most important thing that they said was important to talk about. What's weird is they talk about the thing they think is second more than they talk about the thing they think is first. Right? So we have a problem not in whether they agree about what's wrong, but whether they decide to communicate about it. right? And I think that we know very little from the special education literature about how to address this, but we know a lot from other fields. We know a lot from fields of communication, health communication, negotiation. There's a lot of literature for us to borrow from to think about this. And one of the ways to think about communication that is oriented around problem solving is that it has three components. The first is what we might think of as the primary behavioral involvement. That is, how much do we talk about the thing that we think is wrong and a plan to fix it? You can also talk about secondary behavior involvement, which is, what are the general strengths of this child? What are the general challenges this child faces? What's home like? What's school like? Things that are related to the problem but aren't really the problem. And then we can talk about psychological involvement. That is, how much do you communicate with this person as a person? How much do you show affect? How much do you nod? How much do you acknowledge what the other person is saying? And that these three things are really important in communication. That middle one sets the context. The primary behavioral involvement part is about solving the problem. And the psychological involvement part is that, I know you're a human being, you know I'm a human being, you know we're here for the same reason, to help, right? So all three are important. But what it turns out, when you actually look at what parents and teachers do when they're communicating with each other, there's a lot of secondary behavioral stuff. There's a lot of discussion about the strengths and the weaknesses of this child overall, what the classroom is like, what home is like, and then there's a lot of psychological stuff. That's good, right? It's not an adversarial interaction, at least at that point, at that parent-teacher conference. But in a minority of the time, and very little of the time, do they focus on that primary behavioral component. What's the problem we're trying to fix, and how are we going to fix it? So I think what we have is often two well-intended people who both are astute, or at least agree, about what the problem is, who aren't talking about it, who are dancing around the problem. Now, Ghazi was studying this in the School District of Philadelphia. The School District of Philadelphia can be a challenging place to work. She's particularly interested in the needs of families that don't have a lot of resource to learn about autism, to care for their child, to advocate for their child. But I think these general principles seem to hold up in a lot of different settings. And so what she did was she borrowed a consultation model that comes out of the general education literature developed by a woman named Susan Sheraton. And she said, how could we, and that is, let's meet 3 times, once a week for an hour, and talk about the challenge this child is having in a general education classroom. And Ghazi's like, my parents can't do that. The folks that we're working with can't do that. They have many other challenges. They're just racing to get to that one meeting every semester. So what if we broke it down? So what Ghazi did is she called the parent and she called the teacher separately, and she had a 10-minute conversation with them before the parent-teacher conference. And she asked the parent and teacher about strengths, but not the kids' strengths. She asked them about each other's strengths. She said to the parent, what do you think this teacher is good at? What is she really doing well for your child? She asked the teacher, what do you think this parent is good at? What is she really bringing to the table? So that they could start with a positive sense of each other. They discussed the child's preferences, things like reinforcers, the general framework in which they responded well to instruction, and then they picked specific concerns. And ranked them, and they talked not just about the concern, but in a quantifiable way addressed the frequency and the severity of those concerns. So they had that 10 minutes ahead of time, and then they went into the parent-teacher conference. And Ghazi facilitated this parent-teacher conference. She gave the parent and teachers notes that she had taken from the conversation that they had had. They figured out where their concerns intersected so that they could focus on that particular concern. They shared each other's strengths. And then she went through a very particular process, and this was the most challenging for teachers and parents. Let's figure out how we're going to measure that this is a problem. Let's think about the specific evidence-based plan that we can put into place. Let's provide any materials we need to make that plan work. And then let's make sure we communicated about it. So she had a very simple 1-page homeschool note that went back and forth between the parent and teacher, which listed not just what was happening with regard to that challenge they were trying to address, but also what the parent and teacher were doing in the classroom or the home related to that challenge. And it was okay to say, I just couldn't get it together today to do what I was supposed to do. But so that the teacher would know that, or the parent would know that and could respond accordingly. And then Ghazi called each of them for 10 minutes, 6 weeks after that meeting, to ask, how's that concern doing? What are the frequency and severity of the challenges you're seeing in that child now? And is it working? Great, let's celebrate and let's keep doing it. If it's not working, okay, let's meet again to see what we need to do to change. And remarkably, in a 6-week period, she saw a dramatic reduction in parent-reported challenges related to that specific concern, both on an item that was specific to that concern, but also on a standardized measure. Now, a lot of the concerns were about behavior, as you could imagine, right? And that's where you see the changes on those standardized measures. You see a decrease in challenging behavior. She also saw great improvements in affect and regard between the parents and the teachers for each other. So unfortunately, not all of us have Ghazi, right? And although she does want to move to New York. But the question, so what can you take away as a parent or as a teacher from what she did in your interactions with teachers or with parents? I think the first is to start positive, right? You have to go in with the expectation that you are teammates, that you are enemies. And one of the things that makes you teammates is you find something you agree on, right? That about each other, about the classrooms, about the need of the child. The second is we are often running to these meetings. I know because I'm often running to these meetings with my kids, right? To get to the classroom in time, it's all I can do just to block off that time from work. And like 10 minutes before, I'm like, oh, I gotta go, right? And so you've had no time to think about this meeting and what you're gonna talk about. That may be the most important part. You have to take 10 minutes the night before and write down what it is you wanna talk about. Choose one challenge to share with each other and to focus on. Plan that intervention, agree on how you're going to measure it. And this is, again, often where we fall down. How are you going to know whether the plan is working and you're seeing improvements over time? Share those results in writing. I think that written homeschool note is a critical component of this intervention. And then set a time to meet afterwards so that you can celebrate your success or that you can tweak the plan and try again. This is Ghazi with the first student with autism she had when she was working in a classroom in California, and the girl, she says, has inspired this line of research for her and her career. Thank you.